Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not a fairy tale. There is no knight in shining armor. There is no helpless princess. What you are about to hear is a story about what happens when a woman with nothing but the truth goes to war against a man with everything accepted. And the jacket is just how it started. The iced coffee hit Arya Vance before she heard the laughter. It came from above and behind. A full 32-ounce cup, lid removed, poured with the casual precision of someone who had practiced cruelty until it felt like sport. The liquid was cold enough to make her gasp, sweet enough to soak into every fiber of her white button-down, and public enough to guarantee that everyone crossing Worthington University's main quadrangle at 12:30 on a Wednesday afternoon would remember exactly what they saw. Now pause for a moment. 40 students were standing in that courtyard, 40 people with functioning eyes and working consciences. Not one of them moved, not one. And that tells you more about Worthington University than any brochure ever could. Because cruelty doesn't survive without an audience, and an audience that does nothing is not innocent. It is complicit. Arya stood very still. Iced coffee ran down her hair, along her chin, pooling in the hollow of her collarbone before soaking through to her skin. Her research papers, 3 months of handwritten calculations she'd been organizing on a bench, scattered across the wet granite at her feet, ink bleeding into stone. "Oh my God," a voice said behind her, dripping with theatrical surprise. "I am so sorry, I didn't see you there." Serena Sterling stepped into view, empty cup still dangling from her manicured fingers, flanked by 3 friends who formed a loose semicircle that blocked every direction. Their sorority pins caught the November light. Their phones were already out. "Then again," Serena added, tilting her head with a smile that never reached her eyes, "you're pretty easy to miss." Laughter. Not nervous laughter, the confident, full-throated kind that comes from people who have never once considered that their actions might carry consequences. And here's the detail that makes this scene cut deeper than it already does. Those research papers on the ground, those weren't homework. Those were 3 months of independent data analysis that proved Serena's father, Dr. Julian Sterling, was running one of the largest scientific frauds in American history. Arya didn't know it yet, but the girl pouring coffee on her was protecting a criminal empire worth $400 million. She just thought she was being mean for fun. Arya didn't respond. She gathered what was left of her papers, the ones that weren't already ruined, and stood up to leave. The soaked shirt clung to her body. She crossed her arms over her chest, holding herself together in the most literal way possible. "Where are you going?" one of Serena's friends called out. "Don't you want to thank her? That coffee cost $8, probably more than your outfit." More phones appeared. The crowd grew. 40 students, maybe more, forming a loose ring of spectators who watched the way people watch car accidents, horrified, fascinated, and fundamentally unwilling to intervene. Arya bit the inside of her lip until she tasted blood. She would not cry. She would not give them that. The silence she kept was not weakness. It was the last weapon available to someone who had been stripped of every other one. Remember that silence, because you're going to hear it again at the end of this story. And when you do, it will mean something completely different. That was when the car door opened. The black sedan had been parked along the curb on the far side of the quadrangle for the better part of an hour. Nobody had paid it any attention. Nobody paid attention to parked cars at Worthington. There were too many expensive ones to keep track of. The man who stepped out was tall, dark-haired, wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms. No tie, no jacket. The jacket, a tan blazer, was folded over his left arm. The only detail that didn't match the simplicity was his watch, and only someone who knew watches would have recognized it as something that cost more than most cars on the street. His name was Daniel Thorne. He'd come to Worthington to evaluate the university's Climate Institute before committing a $200 million investment. He'd been watching the scene in the quadrangle for almost 3 minutes, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had seen enough. Now, I want you to think about what Daniel Thorne was actually doing at that university. He wasn't there to tour the campus. He wasn't there to shake hands with the dean. He was there to decide whether to write a check for $200 million to fund the exact project that Arya had just discovered was a fraud. The man about to save her from public humiliation was also, unknowingly, the single largest financial target of the man who had arranged that humiliation. The universe has a sense of timing that no screenwriter could match. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked. Unhurried, deliberate, the kind of walk that parts a crowd without asking permission. Students stepped aside without knowing why, responding to something in his stride that their instincts recognized even if their conscious minds didn't. He stopped beside Arya. Without a word, he unfolded the blazer and draped it over her shoulders. He adjusted the collar once carefully so that it covered her, then he stepped forward, positioning himself between her and every phone in the crowd. The laughter stopped, all of it, all at once, like someone had cut the power. November in Boston, Daniel said evenly to no one and everyone, doesn't keep anyone warm. His eyes found Serena Sterling. He didn't glare. The look he gave her was worse than a glare. It was the look of someone who had just filed everything he'd witnessed in a place where it would be retrieved at a time of his choosing. Serena's smirk froze on her face, then died. And this is what separates real power from the imitation. Serena Sterling had the power of a last name, a sorority, and a circle of friends willing to laugh on command. Daniel Thorne had the power of a man who could buy the building they were all standing in front of and turn it into a parking lot before dinner. But he didn't use that power to humiliate anyone. He used it to cover a shivering woman with a jacket. That's the difference between authority and cruelty. One protects, the other performs. Daniel turned to Arya. Let me get you out of here. She looked up at him, eyes dry, jaw set, the effort of not breaking visible in every line of her face, and studied him the way she studied data, looking for the angle, the catch, the hidden variable. She found nothing. She nodded once and walked beside him toward the car. Behind them, Serena Sterling stood with an empty cup and the first dim suspicion that she had just made a mistake whose consequences she couldn't yet imagine. They ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus. Brennan's, the sign read, a narrow place wedged between a bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of establishment that survived on regulars and stubbornness. Daniel looked exactly as out of place as a man in a $15,000 watch should look in a cafe with mismatched chairs, and he didn't seem to care. He ordered 2 coffees without asking what she wanted. Under normal circumstances, Arya would have found this presumptuous. Under these circumstances, when the coffee arrived hot and black in a ceramic mug that had seen better decades, she wrapped both hands around it and held on. They sat in silence for a full minute while Arya blotted her surviving papers with napkins, separating the salvageable from the destroyed with the methodical calm of someone performing triage. You don't owe me a story, Daniel said. The jacket isn't a transaction. Pay attention to that sentence, because it tells you everything about Daniel Thorne in 8 words. Most people who help you expect something in return, even if it's just the satisfaction of hearing your gratitude. Daniel understood something more sophisticated, that a woman who had just been publicly humiliated did not need the additional burden of feeling indebted to a stranger. He gave her the one thing no one else in that courtyard had offered, the freedom to owe nothing. Who are you? She asked. Someone who should have stepped in sooner. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, it isn't. She almost smiled. Then reaching across the table to set down a ruined page, a small sheaf of printed paper slid from the inner pocket of her bag and landed between them, scattering equations and data across the scarred wood. Arya grabbed for them, but Daniel's eyes had already found the numbers. 3 seconds. That was all it took. His expression changed, the careful neutrality replaced by something sharp and focused and dangerous. This mass balance gap in the net recovery cycle, he said quietly, pointing to a line of differential equations. Someone's been tampering with the decay coefficients to hide the fugitive emissions. Arya's hand stopped moving. Now let me explain what just happened, because this is the moment the story changes direction entirely. Those equations describe the core chemistry of a carbon capture system, a technology designed to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it underground. The mass balance gap Daniel spotted meant that the math didn't add up. More carbon was supposedly being captured than the system could physically process. For a billionaire evaluating a $200 million investment in this exact technology, finding that error wasn't just impressive, it was terrifying, because it meant the project he was about to fund was lying about its most fundamental claim. How long had it been since someone looked at her work and understood it? Not the simplified version she presented in seminars, not the dumbed-down summary she gave to funding committees. The actual work, the complex, unglamorous, mathematically brutal work that lived in the gap between what the Climate Institute claimed to do and what it actually did. How do you know what those mean? She asked. Daniel leaned back. Because I'm the person deciding whether $200 million is about to fund the most important clean energy project in the country or the biggest scientific fraud of the decade. Aria Vans, she said. Daniel Thorne. The name didn't register immediately. Then it did. She'd seen it on every funding document in the Climate Institute's files. Thorne Technologies, the $200 million. You're evaluating Sterling's project, she said. I was. He tapped the equation. Now I'm evaluating something else. He looked at her across the table and something shifted between them. Not romantic, not yet, but a recognition. Two people standing at opposite ends of the same dark tunnel, realizing they'd been walking toward the same truth. Tell me everything, he said. She told him, not because she trusted him. Trust was a resource Arya had learned to ration, but because the alternative was silence, and silence had become Sterling's best weapon. She told him about the 36-hour session in the basement lab where she first noticed the discrepancy. A mass balance error so small most researchers would have dismissed it as rounding. But Arya was not most researchers. She'd written a script to trace the error through 14 months of data and discovered malware buried in the filtration output, multiplying the project's actual carbon capture efficiency by a factor of 400. 400 times? Daniel repeated, his voice flat. 400. The CO2 they claim to be burying underground, according to their own coordinates, it's being shipped to depleted oil wells in the Permian Basin. Enhanced oil recovery. They're not removing carbon from the atmosphere. They're using it to pump more oil. For those unfamiliar with the term, enhanced oil recovery is a real technique where CO2 is injected into old oil wells to push out remaining petroleum. It is the exact opposite of carbon sequestration. Sterling wasn't saving the environment. He was using environmental funding to extract more fossil fuels while collecting hundreds of millions in government tax credits for carbon he never actually buried. It is, when you understand the scale, one of the most cynical crimes imaginable, billing the planet for its own destruction. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, you reported this. I went straight to Sterling. I thought it was a mistake. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. He took off his glasses, smiled at me, and told me my perspective was too narrow to understand the bigger picture. 4 hours later, my scholarship was suspended and my TA position was terminated. Administrative error, they said. No timeline, no appeal. And the girl with the coffee? Serena Sterling, his daughter. Her father told her I was causing problems. She handled the optics. Daniel studied her for a long time. You kept the data. I printed everything before I went to his office. The malware signatures, the coordinate discrepancies, the shipping manifests. She touched the papers between them. It's all here. Smart. It's not smart, it's desperate. I'm a grad student with no funding, no lab access, and a fabricated misconduct charge being built against me as we speak. Sterling has 30 years of reputation, a university board that owes him, and enough lawyers to wallpaper his office. I have a manila folder and a ruined shirt. I want you to sit with that line for a second. I have a manila folder and a ruined shirt. That is the sound of someone who has done the math on their own situation and arrived at a number very close to zero. No money, no allies, no institutional support, just data, and the stubborn refusal to pretend it doesn't exist. This is what whistleblowing actually looks like. Not heroic, not glamorous, desperate. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A door opening, a decision being made. You also have proof that a man is defrauding the federal government out of hundreds of millions in carbon tax credits, he said, and you now have the attention of the person he was counting on to write the next check. He paused. I won't fix this for you, Arya. That's not how this works. And if it were, you wouldn't respect it. But I can give you tools, resources, protection from the physical consequences of what you've started. If you're willing to be the one who blows the whistle, I'll make sure the blast doesn't bury you. She stared at him. The jacket was still on her shoulders, warm and carrying a faint scent of cedar. I'm not doing this for your investment, she said. I know. And I'm not doing this because you gave me your jacket. I know that too. I'm doing this because those numbers are a lie and lies have a body count. The carbon that should be underground is in oil wells, and every barrel they extract adds to the problem that Sterling claims to be solving. He's not saving the planet. He's billing the government for the privilege of destroying it. Daniel nodded once. Then we start. They set up operations in a closed bookstore in Somerville, Sullivan and Reed, 7 miles from campus, leased through a company whose name appeared on no public record. Daniel's cybersecurity team wired the space with encrypted networks. Aria covered the walls with flowcharts and equations. They called it the war room. It looked like a graduate student's nightmare. 3 folding tables, an electric kettle, a whiteboard, and 10,000 pages of evidence that a respected scientist was running a fraud worth hundreds of millions. They worked in that room for 6 weeks. The first week was professional, polite, 2 strangers sharing a table because they happened to need the same thing. Daniel's forensic accountants delivered overnight reports. Aria reverse-engineered Sterling's code line by meticulous line. They communicated in data, spreadsheets, flowcharts, email chains, and went home to separate apartments at the end of each night. The second week, they started arguing. You're looking at the money like it's a river, Aria said one night, standing at the whiteboard in her stocking feet because her shoes had been wet from the walk and she'd left them by the door. It's not. It's a circulatory system. The shell companies are channels. They're organs. Remove the wrong one and the whole body adapts. And you're looking at the corporate structure like it's a genome, Daniel replied from the floor where he sat with his back against a shelf of unsold paperbacks. It's a contract. Every entity exists because a lawyer signed it. Find the signature. Find the liability. They stared at each other across the room. Then Aria lowered the marker. Both, she said. Both, he agreed. It was the closest they'd come to a moment of tenderness, and neither of them acknowledged it. What's fascinating about the way their relationship developed is what it wasn't. There were no grand romantic gestures, no expensive dinners, no dramatic confessions. What happened between Daniel and Aria was something far more rare and far more honest. 2 intellects recognizing each other as equals. In a world that had treated Aria as disposable and Daniel as a checkbook, they found in each other the one thing neither could buy or fake, a mind that operated at the same frequency. But the small things accumulated. Daniel noticed Aria's phone died every afternoon. The next day, a charged battery appeared at her workstation. No note, no comment. Aria noticed Daniel drank his coffee black, but ate nothing until someone put food in front of him. She started buying 2 sandwiches instead of 1, leaving the second one on his stack of documents without explanation. Their arguments lost their sharp edges. They began finishing each other's sentences. Not in the cute movie way, but in the efficient way of 2 people whose minds had learned to operate at the same speed. One night at 3 o'clock in the morning, Daniel sat on the floor eating a cold sandwich. Aria was at the whiteboard, barefoot, her hand moving through equations with a focus that blocked out everything. The cold, the exhaustion, the fact that her entire academic career was being dismantled while she stood in a closed bookstore tracing the financial anatomy of a crime. He watched her hands, the same hands that had clutched a coffee mug at Brennan's, the same hands that shook when she was tired but steadied the moment she picked up a marker, and felt something shift in his chest. Not pity, never pity, recognition. In a world full of people who wanted something from him, this woman wanted nothing except the truth, and she was willing to lose everything to get it. He didn't say any of this. He ate his sandwich and went back to the spreadsheets. Another night, the longest one, the one when they finally cracked the Delaware Shell Company network and traced the money through 4 countries before it circled back to a Cayman Islands account in Sterling's name. Aria fell asleep at the table. One moment she was annotating a document. The next, her head was resting on a stack of printouts. Pen still in her hand, the tension gone from her face. The controlled precision replaced by something younger and less defended. Daniel stood. He took off his jacket, the same tan blazer, now a familiar object, draped over her shoulders so often it had started to carry her scent alongside his, and laid it across her carefully. It was the third time he'd done this. He suspected it wouldn't be the last. He stood there longer than necessary, hands in his pockets, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing while the first snow of the season pressed against the papered windows. Then he went back to work. Sterling hit back fast. A 40-page report landed on the University Disciplinary Committee's desk. Fabricated evidence that Arya had plagiarized her research, forged data, stolen intellectual property. Her lab keycard was deactivated overnight. Her chemical samples were confiscated by campus security. The Whisper Network did the rest. Did you hear about the Vance girl caught stealing research? Sterling had to report her himself. These scholarship students, honestly, this is how institutional power actually works. And it's worth understanding because it happens every day in universities, corporations, and governments around the world. Sterling didn't need to prove Arya was guilty. He just needed to make the accusation loud enough and detailed enough that the institution's own bureaucracy would do the rest. A 40-page report triggers a formal review. A formal review suspends the accused's access. Suspended access means no lab, no data, no ability to continue working. And while the review drags on for months, the Whisper Network, that invisible machinery of reputation destruction, does what no official process ever could. It makes the accused radioactive. No one wants to be seen with someone under investigation. No one wants to collaborate with someone who might be guilty. The truth becomes irrelevant. The accusation is the punishment. Serena Sterling orchestrated the social campaign with the same efficient cruelty she'd applied in the quadrangle. She never posted anything herself. That would be traceable. She seeded the narrative through sorority sisters and sympathetic TAs. Within 10 days, Arya couldn't walk across campus without people crossing the street to avoid her. Someone stuffed copies of the university's plagiarism policy into her mailbox, unsigned. Arya weathered it the way she weathered everything. In silence, with discipline, by showing up at the war room every morning at 7 o'clock and working until she couldn't keep her eyes open. But Daniel saw the toll in the things she couldn't hide. The weight she was losing, the dark circles that had become permanent, the slight tremor in her hands when she held her tea. One evening, she arrived 20 minutes late, which had never happened before. She sat at her workstation and opened her laptop and stared at the screen without moving. Daniel waited. He'd learned that with Arya, silence was not an invitation to fill. It was a door that opened on its own schedule. My landlord taped an eviction notice to my door this morning, she said without looking up. 3 weeks behind on rent. No. The word came out with such quiet force that it ended the sentence before it began. I didn't tell you so you would fix it. I told you because you're the only person I talk to anymore. And I needed to say it out loud so it would stop echoing in my head. That single word, no, tells you everything about Arya Vance. A billionaire just offered to solve her most pressing problem, and she refused. Not out of pride, but out of principle. She understood something that most people never learn. The moment you let someone else fight your battle for you, you lose the right to call the victory yours. And for a woman whose entire identity was being systematically erased by a man with more power, the right to own her own story was the one thing she would not surrender. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he pulled his chair beside hers, opened a spreadsheet, and pointed to a line of data they'd been struggling with for 2 days. Look at this transaction cluster from October, he said. I think your circulatory system theory was right. The money's not flowing out, it's cycling. She looked at the screen, then at him, then back at the screen, and for the first time in weeks, her hands stopped trembling. They worked until midnight. When she left, Daniel made a phone call. Not to her landlord, not to pay her rent. To his legal team, accelerate the timeline. She can't hold out much longer. He did none of the things his instincts screamed at him to do. He didn't hire lawyers for her defense. He didn't restore her scholarship with a phone call. He didn't end Serena's campaign with one conversation with the university's board, 3 of whose members owed their chairs to Thorne Technologies grants, because he understood what Arya would not have forgiven him for. If he moved too early, Sterling would destroy the evidence. The digital trail would vanish. The shell companies would dissolve, and Arya would be left holding accusations she could never prove. To kill the empire, he needed the emperor's own records, the unencrypted master ledger. Every dirty transaction, every falsified data set, every dollar laundered through Delaware shell companies, sat on a server in Sterling's private office. A server connected to no network, accessible only through Sterling's biometric authentication. "I'm going in," Arya said one evening, standing at the whiteboard with a campus security map spread across the table. Daniel's chair scraped the floor as he stood. "No, the winter faculty gala is Friday. Sterling will be there for 3 hours minimum. I know that building better than anyone. You're describing breaking into a secure facility. The legal exposure alone, the legal exposure of what Sterling is doing is federal prison. The legal exposure of me copying a file is nothing compared to $400 million in fraud. There has to be another way." Arya looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd looked at him across the table at Brennan's, reading him for the angle, the hidden variable. But this time she wasn't looking for deception. She was looking for understanding. "They took my scholarship, Daniel. They took my lab. They took my name. Everyone on that campus thinks I'm a thief. The only thing I have left is the ability to walk into that building and take back the truth. If I let you do it for me, if I let your lawyers or your money or your connections do it, then they were right about me. Then I really am just someone else's charity case." The war room was quiet except for the electric kettle, which someone had forgotten to turn off and which emitted a thin, persistent whistle. Snow was falling outside the papered windows. "I can't stop you," Daniel said finally. "No, but I'll be there, outside, waiting." "I know." Friday night, Worthington's winter faculty gala filled Harrington Hall with 300 guests in evening wear. Sterling worked the room with practiced charm, accepting congratulations for the Climate Institute's latest milestones, with a humility so convincing that Arya might have believed it herself once, before she'd seen the numbers behind the smile. She entered the Dalton Science Building at 8:47 p.m. through a maintenance door whose code hadn't been changed in 4 years. The building was dark. Her footsteps echoed on linoleum. A USB drive hung on a lanyard around her neck, bumping against her chest with each step. She took the stairs. She waited at each landing. She listened. Sterling's office door opened with a 6-digit override code that every senior researcher knew and no one admitted to knowing. The server sat in the corner, a black tower, disconnected from every network, holding its secrets behind a biometric login. But Arya hadn't come to crack Sterling's fingerprint. She'd come because she knew something the security consultants didn't. The server's backup protocol ran every night at midnight and wrote to an unencrypted partition for exactly 12 minutes before encrypting. A 12-minute window. That was all she needed. She sat in Sterling's chair and waited. On his desk, framed photographs. Sterling with the governor, Sterling with the Nobel laureate, Sterling at the Climate Institute groundbreaking. The same smile in every photo, the smile of a man who had confused his reputation with the truth. At midnight, the backup protocol kicked in. The server hummed. She connected the USB drive. Data began to transfer. At 12:04, she heard the stairwell door open 1 floor below. Footsteps, dress shoes, unhurried. The progress bar crawled. 67%, 74%, 81%. A key scraped in the lock. 89%, 93%. The lock turned, and then every fire alarm in the Dalton Science Building screamed to life. The sprinklers activated. Emergency lights strobed. Sterling, because it was Sterling, she could hear him swearing, recoiled from the noise and darkness, and retreated down the hallway toward the emergency exit. 97%, 100%. Arya ripped the USB from the port, yanked open the window, and climbed onto the maintenance ledge 4 stories above the parking lot. The cold hit her like a fist. Snow was falling thick and fast, turning the campus into a white blur. She descended the fire escape with numb hands, dropped the last 6 feet, and ran. She ran until she reached the old railway bridge on the Somerville line, the arch where they'd agreed to meet. Daniel was standing there alone, his car idling 50 yards away, headlights cutting white tunnels through the snow. He saw her come stumbling out of the storm, and his composure, the thing he'd worn like armor through every negotiation, every boardroom confrontation, every Senate hearing, cracked open. He crossed the distance in 4 strides. He pulled her into him so hard she could feel his heartbeat through 3 layers of clothing, fast and irregular, The heartbeat of a man who had just spent 45 minutes imagining every possible way this could have gone wrong. "Don't," he said into her hair, and his voice was raw. "Don't ever do that again." Arya stood rigid for one more second, one final act of independence, and then she let go. She pressed her face into his chest and let the shaking come. Not from cold, from everything. The lab, the scholarship, the coffee on her shirt, the months of fighting alone, the weight of carrying a truth that no one wanted to hear. Daniel tilted her face up. Snow caught in her eyelashes and melted in tiny constellations on her skin. He kissed her, slowly, deliberately, with a certainty that had been building for 6 weeks, and that neither of them had been willing to name. She kissed him back, not with gratitude, with recognition. Two people who had been pretending that the evidence was the only thing between them, finally admitting that the most important truth in the room had always been the simplest one. The USB drive pressed against both their chests, small and hard and full of consequences. Monday morning, 9 o'clock a.m., the 7th floor boardroom of Worthington University's administration building. Dr. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the conference table, laptop open, presentation loaded, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most of his graduate students earned in a semester. The university provost sat to his left. 3 board members sat to his right. Fresh flowers, white lilies, occupied the center of the table. This was the day. The signing ceremony for the Thorne Technologies grant. $200 million, the largest single donation in Worthington's history. Sterling had rehearsed his remarks about the marriage of innovation and integrity. The irony was about to become apparent. At 9:12, the boardroom doors opened. Arya walked in first, navy blazer, white blouse, spine straight. She carried a single folder. Behind her came Daniel Thorne. He was no longer the man in rolled-up sleeves who'd handed a jacket to a soaked girl in a courtyard. He wore a 3-piece suit cut so precisely it looked like it had been designed as a weapon. His presence didn't enter the room. It reorganized it. Every person at the table understood instantly and wordlessly that the balance of power had just shifted in a direction from which it would not shift back. Flanking him were 3 attorneys specializing in federal whistleblower cases. Behind the attorneys, 2 plainclothes agents from the Department of Justice. The provost stood up so fast her chair hit the wall. Mr. Thorne, we weren't expecting the signing." "There won't be a signing," Daniel said. "What happened in that boardroom is a masterclass in the difference between theatrical revenge and actual justice." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult Sterling. He didn't deliver a speech about right and wrong. He simply presented facts in the correct order to the correct authorities with the correct documentation. That is what real power looks like, not noise, precision. Sterling's smile held for 3 seconds. Then he saw the folder in Arya's hands. Arya set it on the table. The sound it made, small, flat, final, was somehow the loudest thing in the room. At 7 o'clock a.m. this morning, as Daniel said, my legal team delivered a comprehensive evidence package to the United States Department of Justice documenting systematic data falsification, the operation of shell companies for the fraudulent claiming of federal carbon tax credits, and the diversion of research funds to enhanced oil recovery operations. The total estimated fraud exceeds $400 million. He looked at Sterling, a long, level, absolutely impersonal look. Thorne Technologies does not fund the concealment of federal crimes. Sterling opened his mouth. This is absurd. This student has been under investigation for academic fraud. Her credibility, Arya said the first time she'd spoken, is documented in 14 months of independently verified data, corroborated by forensic accounting, digital forensics, and a complete copy of your private server's master ledger. She opened the folder, including the entry from March 14th, in which you personally authorized the transfer of $4.2 million in grant funds to a shell company called Greenfield Recovery, LLC, a company whose only function is selling liquefied CO2 to Permian Basin oil producers. Sterling's face didn't crumble. It emptied expression by expression, like a building being evacuated, until nothing was left but the bare structure of a man watching every exit seal shut. The DOJ agent stepped forward. The handcuffs made a small, precise sound as they closed. "Dr. Julian Sterling, You are under arrest for wire fraud, false claims against the United States government, and money laundering." In the observer's gallery at the far end of the room, Serena Sterling sat watching her father led toward the door in handcuffs. Her face was the color of the white lilies on the table. Her friends, the ones from the quadrangle, the ones with the phones and the laughter, were not there. They had not been invited. They would not be taking her calls. She looked across the room at Arya, and what Arya saw in her face was not anger. It was the slow, awful recognition of a person who had just discovered that the world she was born into, the world of last names and sorority pins, and the belief that consequences were things that happened to other people, had a floor, and she had just fallen through it. There is a particular kind of justice that doesn't require a single word of gloating. It is the justice of simply being present, standing upright in a room where the person who tried to destroy you is being led away in handcuffs. Arya didn't smile. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence in that room was the loudest statement anyone could have made. Arya held Serena's gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, not in triumph, in exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had told the truth and paid the full price for telling it and survived. Spring came to Boston the way it always does, grudgingly in fits and starts, winter letting go 1 degree at a time, until one morning the trees along the Charles River bloomed, and everyone pretended they hadn't spent 5 months questioning their life choices. Arya completed her PhD using her own data, verified by an independent review board. The university's provost issued a formal apology. The academic journals published corrections. Sterling's 40-page fabricated report was retracted and entered into evidence at his federal trial. None of these things felt like vindication. They felt like the end of a very long year. The research center, Daniel had insisted on calling it the Vance Thorne Clean Energy Research Center, and Arya had resisted until he pointed out that the researchers who would work there deserved to know whose integrity made it possible, occupied a converted warehouse on the East Boston waterfront. Brick exterior, glass interior, flooded with light. On a Tuesday in late April, Arya stood at a whiteboard in the center's main lab, explaining a carbon mineralization pathway to a group of graduate students. She wore a white lab coat. Her handwriting on the board was the same handwriting that had covered the walls in Somerville. Precise, urgent, alive. Daniel appeared in the doorway. Shirt sleeves, no jacket. The jacket was draped over a chair somewhere, forgotten. He leaned against the frame and watched her the way he'd been watching her for months, with the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. The students filed out. The lab emptied. Daniel walked to where Arya stood. He took her hand, her left hand, the one with the scar on the index finger from a first-year lab accident, the hand that had held a USB drive through a snowstorm, and laced his fingers through hers. "What's next, Dr. Vance?" She looked at him. Sunlight through the lab windows caught the equations on the whiteboard behind her, illuminating formulas that would, in time, form the basis of a technology that actually worked. "Change the world," she said, "starting with us." Daniel smiled, the real one, the rare one, the one she'd first seen in a cafe that smelled like old books. Outside, the Charles River caught the spring light and held it. The city exhaled. Something new was beginning. Sometimes the people who pour cold water on your dreams are the same ones who teach you how to walk through fire. Arya never needed saving. She needed someone who believed her truth was worth fighting for. And in the end, the jacket wasn't what protected her. It was the integrity she refused to take off. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the cost of telling the truth, or the power of standing beside someone when the whole world turns away, then hit that like button and subscribe. A new story drops every day, and trust me, the next one hits even harder. See you tomorrow.